Get them on the ground! Now! Harris barked, his voice cutting through the noise of chaos. The sudden wave of blinding light from the Solkran warship's weapons flared against the night sky, igniting the streets below like a roaring wildfire. The sound of crashing metal and the hiss of superheated air filled the atmosphere, as the city's defenses, once formidable, crumbled under the force of the ancient weaponry. A sharp, acrid tang of burning concrete filled Harris's nostrils, cutting through the shock of disbelief that had gripped him moments before. He ran, his boots pounding against the trembling ground, the distant wail of emergency sirens, a futile echo in the madness. His eyes locked onto the burning skyline, where towers of steel and glass, symbols of Earth's peaceful dominance, melted like wax under the unrelenting fire of the alien assault. The Solkran ship, once thought to be myth, hung in the sky like a colossal, malignant moon, its jagged edges reflecting the red light of the setting sun. The massive vessel, pockmarked with scars of ages long past, seemed to mock humanity's false sense of security. A quiet arrogance had settled in the hearts of humans after centuries of diplomacy and trade, an unspoken belief that they were untouchable. But all of that had shattered in an instant. "Harris, over here!" A voice broke through his thoughts, snapping him back to the present. He turned sharply to see Captain Vance, one of the last remaining commanders of Earth's defense forces, motioning toward the shelter of a ruined building. "They've disabled every defense system." Vance's voice was tight with panic. His face, usually a mask of stoic resolve, was flushed with the strain of realizing how far their preparation had missed the mark. "Our railguns, they're useless. The shield's gone. It's like they've stripped us down to nothing." "Then we fight like we used to," Harris replied, his tone low but intense. His eyes glinted with an unreadable resolve. "The old way. We don't need their tech. We've got something better." Vance stared at him, confused for a moment, before his eyes widened in understanding. "You're talking about the archives. The old combat techniques." Harris didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a deep breath, the acrid smoke burning his lungs, and began moving toward the crumbling building. His hands, still trembling from the initial shock, balled into fists at his side. In his mind, the words his grandfather had once spoken to him came rushing back. "You might think the world is peaceful, but peace is just a lull before the storm, and when it breaks, you better know how to survive." Those words, once considered relics of a bygone age, rang louder than the sirens around them. Vance fell in step beside him. "But those techniques, can they really work now? The Solkran have weapons that could level whole cities in seconds. What do we have?" "We have our past," Harris replied, his voice unwavering despite the rising fear in his chest. "The past is alive. You just need to know how to awaken it." The building loomed ahead, its broken windows like gaping wounds in the side of the structure. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the metallic scent of destruction hanging heavy. Harris gestured for the others to follow, and the small group of survivors, mostly former soldiers, scientists, and civilians caught in the crossfire, began to move inside. As Harris reached the central hub of the ruins, his fingers brushed over the rusted control panel. His heart raced as he keyed in the old sequence. Lights flickered to life, casting sharp shadows across the room. On the walls, large-scale displays activated, showing maps of Earth, the galaxy, and military formations long abandoned. The words, "Humanity's past defense systems," blinked in red across the screen, stark against the otherwise dim glow. "The Solkran think we're weak, Vance," Harris muttered as he scanned the data. "But we're not just humans. We're descendants of warriors who survived the worst. We've forgotten that strength, but it's still in us. They'll learn that soon enough." Vance leaned in closer, the light from the screen reflecting in his eyes. "How are you so sure?" "Because," Harris said, pausing as if considering his next words carefully, "we're not like the other races. We adapt. We learn. And when the dust settles, we'll be standing tall, even if it's only a few of us left." The silence in the room was thick, the weight of Harris's words sinking in. The steady thrum of a distant explosion vibrated through the walls, a reminder of the ever-present threat. They didn't have much time, but Harris didn't need time. He needed the will to push forward, the same will that had carried humanity through countless trials. The survivors around him began to murmur, their fear palpable. They were all survivors of a peaceful world, not soldiers by nature, but people who had lived their lives under the false comfort of intergalactic trade. Yet here they were, on the brink of annihilation, their only hope buried in the forgotten strategies of a time when Earth was anything but peaceful. "Listen up," Harris called, his voice cutting through the uncertainty like a blade. "We may not have railguns, but we've got something better. Our brains, our instincts, and the lessons that our ancestors left us. Let's dig in and make those lessons work. These Solkren might be ancient, but we're the ones who've learned how to outlive the worst of them. Now it's time to teach them who we really are." The room grew quiet. The weight of his words settled over them, as the first glimmers of hope sparked in their eyes. Harris didn't care about the odds. He had seen Earth's brightest moments, had seen it all crumble into the abyss. Now, it was time to see if humanity's spirit still had the strength to fight. One of the men, an old veteran named Vance, whose hands had trembled when they first spoke, stood straighter now. He nodded once, the remnants of his doubt beginning to fade. "All right, Harris, lead us, but no more speeches. I want to see action." Harris smirked, his gaze shifting back to the screen. "You'll see plenty of action. Just wait for it." As the last words echoed through the room, a flash of light exploded in the distance, and a voice rang through the comms. "Solkren forces inbound, 20 minutes to impact." It was time to awaken humanity's past and show the Solkren that peace, when shattered, turns into something far deadlier than they could ever have imagined. The rumble of distant explosions echoed through the crumbling structure, reverberating like the heartbeat of a dying world. Harris's fingers hovered over the control panel as the dim glow of the plasma display bathed the room in a cold, sickly light. The ancient symbols flashed on the screen, jarring against the sterile, modern interface. His mind raced. This was their last chance, the last thread to cling to in a rapidly unraveling tapestry. If he couldn't find the knowledge buried in the archives, Earth's fate would be sealed. Vance, standing a few feet away, his back pressed against the cracked wall, shifted uncomfortably. His face was set in grim determination, but his eyes betrayed him. A flicker of fear for a moment, gone as quickly as it came. The Solkren weren't just invaders. They were an embodiment of humanity's darkest fear, an extinction-level force that seemed too immense, too old to be defeated by anything modern. How much longer? Vance's voice was low, cutting through the tense silence. Harris glanced over, the sweat on his brow slipping down into his eyes. "Not long. They'll be here soon. I need another minute." The stench of burning rubble wafted into the room, clinging to the air like a rancid blanket. Harris could almost taste the dust in his mouth, thick and gritty. Each breath felt like a strike against his lungs, but he didn't dare stop. Time was slipping through his fingers like sand in an hourglass, fragile, fleeting, and unrelenting. Behind him, one of the younger soldiers, a wide-eyed recruit named Marcus, shifted nervously, his boots scraping against the cracked floor. "Harris, do you really think this is going to work?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying the rawness of his fear. Harris didn't look at him, keeping his gaze locked on the screen. "If we don't try, Marcus, then the Solkren win by default." His words were harsh, but not unkind. He could hear the trembling in Marcus's voice, but it wasn't fear that they needed to overcome. It was doubt. Doubt was the real enemy here. The soldiers had all lived their lives in a world of peace, trade, diplomacy, stability. They weren't soldiers by nature, but survivors, born into a time when war was relegated to history books, a distant past that felt as alien as the threat they now faced. The plasma display flickered, and Harris' fingers pressed harder against the keys, his pulse quickening. A loud crack resounded from outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of an energy weapon discharging. Another city block fell to the Solkren's assault. Harris knew they had precious little time. A new set of data began to blink on the screen, a map of Earth, not as it was now, but as it had been during humanity's last war with the Solkren. He could feel the weight of the moment settle over him, his breath catching in his chest. This was it, the key to their survival, to everything they had built. The Solkran had underestimated the strength of their past, but Harris was about to remind them that history had never truly been forgotten. It had simply waited, dormant, beneath the surface. Vance stepped forward, his boots dragging against the debris-littered floor. This map? This is the battlefield from the last war? The one with the Solkran? Harris nodded, his fingers tracing over the coordinates. It's not just a map. It's the last known location of humanity's greatest weapon, the one the Solkran fear most. Marcus, still hovering by the door, leaned in. What weapon? What are we talking about? Harris didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked over the old map, lingering on a section of Earth's surface that had been abandoned for centuries, deep within the craggy hills of a forgotten mountain range. The coordinates marked the place where humanity's final stand had taken place, where ancient human warriors, fighting with nothing but steel, grit, and sheer will, had held off the Solkran in a battle that should have been lost. Not a weapon like they'd expect, Harris said quietly, almost to himself. It's a mindset, a philosophy, a way of fighting. This weapon doesn't rely on technology. It relies on us. The silence in the room thickened, the weight of his words pressing down on them. The soldiers exchanged looks, their uncertainty hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. They had been raised to rely on modern weapons, sleek, clean, efficient. Now, they were being asked to fight with something older, something raw. Marcus swallowed, his throat working as he tried to grasp the enormity of the situation. So, we're going to use old-fashioned tactics, with no tech to back us up? Harris's eyes never left the screen, but his voice was firm. Exactly. We need to dig into our past, remember who we are, what we've survived. If the Solkran expect us to go down quietly, they've made a deadly mistake. Vance, who had been standing in the corner staring at the map, finally spoke up. And you think we can do this? I've seen war, Harris. I know how this goes. It's not just the weapons. They're coming for us with everything they've got. And we're supposed to beat them with old tactics? Old tactics are all we've got left, Harris said. His eyes narrowed as he turned away from the screen and locked eyes with Vance. And those tactics will work because they never expected us to fight like this. We've forgotten how powerful we are, how much we've survived. But the Solkran, they haven't changed. They think they can erase us, but history will make sure they're wrong. There was a long, heavy pause. The men stood in the darkened room, the weight of Harris's words settling over them. The building was shaking now, more violently than before. The Solkran were getting closer, their attacks battering Earth's defenses like waves crashing against a cliff. The sounds of distant explosions grew louder, the air thick with the smell of burning rubble, singeing their skin, and the ground beneath their feet groaned, as if protesting the violence above. "We're out of time," Vance muttered. "We either use this, or we die." Harris nodded, his face hardening. "We use it, and we fight like we've never fought before." They began moving toward the exit, ready to put the ancient plan into action. Harris could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, not out of fear, but of anticipation. The Solkran were on the verge of victory, but they had one fatal flaw. They thought humanity's strength had been erased by time. They were wrong. Harris looked back at the display one last time, the map flickering as the screen lost its signal. His fingers brushed against the cold, cracked surface of the control panel, a silent promise to his ancestors. This was just the beginning. The Solkran would soon learn that humanity had always been more than the sum of its technology. "We don't need their technology," Harris said, voice low but fierce. "We just need to remember who we are." Harris stood still for a moment, his eyes fixed on the ruined cityscape ahead. The walls of the old military headquarters, once a symbol of Earth's advanced defenses, were crumbling under the pressure of an onslaught that came from an enemy they hadn't expected, one that had no place in the bright, clean future humanity had built. The Solkran were unlike anything the world had seen in centuries, an ancient force, sharp-edged and unyielding, like a storm from a time long forgotten. How long until they hit? Vance's voice broke through the stillness, a steady whisper of anxiety barely contained. He was scanning the horizon through the scope of his weapon, his fingers tight around the barrel. The air smelled of scorched metal and the acrid bite of smoke, an unmistakable reminder that their peaceful world had been shattered, and there was no turning back now. Harris's gaze swept across the landscape, his mind spinning the tactical pieces together. "They'll be here in less than 5 minutes," he said, the words barely escaping his lips as his eyes locked onto the screen of the plasma display beside him. The map of the surrounding area flickered, showing red dots as the Solkran fleet closed in. The enemy's movements were as erratic as they were brutal, like an avalanche crashing down the mountain. A faint, shrill scream of the wind, accompanied by the familiar clank of metal boots, echoed from their flank. Harris turned his attention to the team gathered behind him. Each one of them was preparing, but the uncertainty was palpable. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. They weren't meant to fight with fists or old tactics. They were meant to rely on technology, the epitome of modern civilization. Yet here they were, stripped of everything they'd once known, fighting with nothing but the faint whispers of humanity's forgotten strength. "Let's move," Harris barked, forcing his thoughts back into the present. "Stick to the plan. We need to be unpredictable. If we're going to survive, we can't let them see what's coming." The soldiers nodded, adjusting their gear. A quiet tension settled over them, and they scattered, forming a loose perimeter around Harris. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of the earth, charred remnants of trees, and the deep, earthy smell of the land that humanity had tried to protect. It was strange how such a familiar scent now felt like a war drum, signaling that the battle was near. As the team moved into position, Harris couldn't help but glance at Marcus, who was checking his rifle with a practiced hand, his face still drawn tight with nerves. The kid was green. There was no other way to put it. A handful of soldiers like him had been thrust into the madness with no training, no idea of the terror that awaited them. But they had no choice. Every hand had to fight. "Marcus," Harris said, walking up to him, "you're with me." Marcus looked up, meeting Harris's eyes. There was a flicker of doubt there, but it disappeared as quickly as it had come. "Understood, sir." They moved in silence, each step careful, deliberate, as if the earth itself was listening. Every movement was calculated, every breath measured. The sky above had darkened further, thick clouds rolling in as the Solkran approached. A sense of impending doom hung heavy in the air, like the world was holding its breath. The Solkran ships, crimson hulks of ancient metal, slowly revealed themselves on the horizon, their jagged silhouettes cutting through the darkening sky. The enemy wasn't here to negotiate. Harris knew that much. They were here to burn, to erase humanity's existence from the galaxy. The Solkran didn't care for peace. They had no use for diplomacy. Their eyes were on destruction, and nothing would stand in their way. "We're going to fight them like we fought before," Harris muttered, more to himself than to Marcus. "And we're going to use their own arrogance against them." Marcus didn't respond immediately, but the weight of Harris's words seemed to settle in the air between them. They moved swiftly into a makeshift trench where the rest of the team was already huddled. The laser plasma displays flickered above, showing the advancing Solkran warships closing in. The readouts of the plasma cannon's power cells blinked urgently. Time was slipping away faster than Harris would have liked. Vance, watching the display, cursed under his breath. "They're too damn close. We don't have enough power to engage them head-on with the artillery we've got left." "We don't need to engage them head-on," Harris said, his voice cutting through the tension. "We need to be ghosts. We make them think we're weak, and then we hit them where it hurts. We've got the terrain advantage. They can't adapt to our environment. They've never fought like we do. They've never fought humans." There was a shift in the air as the first rumble of explosions echoed through the ground. The Solkran ships had arrived, their massive forms blotting out the faint glow of the sky above. Harris's chest tightened as he heard the roar of their weapons charging, felt the heat radiating from the blasts that struck the distant cityscape. For a moment, he wondered if this was how it had felt for his ancestors, the ones who had fought against forces far greater than themselves, with no hope but the will to survive. "Now," Harris whispered. And then they moved. Marcus and the others scrambled forward, moving swiftly and quietly, their boots pounding against the earth. Harris led the charge, his mind whirring with the calculations. They had trained for this, on a world that had long since forgotten what real combat felt like. This was humanity's last chance to make the galaxy remember. The first of the Sulcran infantry stormed the area, their hulking forms charging through the haze of gunfire. But they were unprepared for the brutal efficiency of humanity's counterattack. Harris and his team didn't engage directly. Instead, they struck like shadows, using the landscape to their advantage. Marcus fired first, his shots deadly and accurate, forcing the alien forces to stumble back in confusion. The team picked off the Sulcran soldiers one by one, their fire precise but brief, leaving only chaos in their wake. The Sulcran retaliated with raw, brutal force, but they hadn't anticipated human adaptability. They were too slow, too heavy in their movements, and the ancient tactics Harris had resurrected, attacks from angles they hadn't considered, left them struggling to regroup. But Harris could feel it in his bones. This wasn't enough. The Sulcran were only testing them, probing for weaknesses. This battle wasn't about brute strength. It was about surviving the storm. They had to keep pushing forward, every move calculated, every shot a necessary risk. The ground shook beneath them as another explosion went off nearby. Harris winced, the ringing in his ears drowning out the shouts of his men. The battle was far from over. They had made the Sulcran bleed, but now the real fight was about to begin. As the dust settled, a cold thought struck Harris like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't their victory. Not yet. This was only the beginning. And the Sulcran, for all their power, had no idea what humanity was capable of when it was backed into a corner. "Get ready," Harris growled, his voice low and fierce. "They're coming back for more, and this time, we don't hold back." The staccato blasts of gunfire had barely faded when Harris felt the first tremor of the coming storm. The air around them vibrated with the thundering rumble of alien artillery, shaking the ruins of the city like an angry beast. It wasn't just the sound of battle, it was the feeling of the ground beneath his boots, the vibration in his bones. Every shot from the Sulcran shook the very foundation of Earth's defense, every wave of fire leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. The city seemed to hold its breath, caught in the grip of a force that would either crush it or breathe new life into it. "Stay sharp," Harris barked, snapping out of his momentary daze. His voice cut through the tension like a blade, and the men around him, their faces drawn tight with the weight of the battle, shifted into position. His eyes darted to the laser plasma displays overhead, the readouts flickering and flashing in sharp relief, showing the advancing Sulcran forces as bright red marks on the digital map. The enemy's ships had circled overhead, dropping troops like raindrops, relentless and unforgiving. The scent of burnt earth mixed with the faint tang of sweat clinging to the air, but it was the quiet after the battle that unnerved him most. The Sulcran were strategic. They were testing their limits, feeling out the weaknesses of Earth's new defense. The strategy was too familiar, too calculated. They didn't just want to destroy, they wanted to break. They were waiting for humanity to crack. Marcus, standing close by, wiped his brow with a trembling hand, the young recruit's unease apparent in his every movement. Harris couldn't blame him. They were all on the edge, constantly moving, always fighting. But the longer the Sulcran attacked, the clearer it became. This was more than just a war for survival. This was a war for history itself, humanity's history. "Captain," Vance called, his voice sharp. The older man, a veteran of wars long past, was scanning the laser plasma display. His brow furrowed as he zoomed in on a particular section of the map where a cluster of Sulcran warships had begun to circle. "Something's off. They're not moving like a standard assault force. This is different." "What do you mean?" Harris asked, stepping forward. Vance tapped the screen, his finger tracing a line along the enemy's formation. "They're positioning themselves around a specific area, a pattern, almost like they're looking for something." Harris squinted at the display, his pulse quickening. His mind raced, pulling at the fragmented memories of ancient texts he'd uncovered, texts that spoke of Solkran strategy. They had always fought with singular purpose, never deviating from their methodical strikes. But this felt like more than just an assault. It felt like they were being lured into a trap. "I think you're right," Harris said slowly, his voice low. "They're not just here to destroy us. They're searching for something, and I don't think it's just Earth they want. It's something older, something buried beneath the surface." "What?" Marcus asked, his eyes wide. "What could they want here that's more important than the planet?" Harris didn't answer right away. His fingers moved across the laser display, zooming in on the section of the city that had once housed humanity's greatest military assets, an area that had long since been abandoned after the war ended. He had always thought it was nothing more than a relic of the past, a place where humanity's history had been stored and forgotten. But now, as the enemy's movements became clearer, it was beginning to click into place. The Solkran weren't just here for conquest. They were looking for something hidden away long before the current peace had settled over Earth. He turned to the group, his jaw tight. "We need to get there, now." Vance raised an eyebrow. "You're not suggesting we just waltz into their line of fire, are you?" "We don't have a choice," Harris replied. "If we can find what they're after before they do, we might stand a chance. But we have to move fast." The group didn't hesitate. They knew better than to question Harris's decisions, even when they didn't fully understand them. There was something in the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, an air of certainty that seemed to break through the confusion. As they moved out, Harris's mind churned, revisiting the forgotten strategies his ancestors had once used against the Solkran. This wasn't just about military tactics. This was about surviving against an enemy that had seen it all before, an enemy that had no use for mercy. The Solkran didn't fight like others. They fought with knowledge. They fought with a purpose that transcended victory. But what were they searching for? The sound of boots hitting cracked pavement filled the air as they made their way through the abandoned streets. The tension was palpable, thick in the air like the fog rolling in from the ocean. The sky above was heavy with clouds, the sharp, bitter taste of the impending storm hanging on the wind. Marcus, still visibly nervous, kept glancing over at Harris. "Do you really think they're looking for something we left behind? Something we didn't even know about?" Harris nodded slowly, eyes scanning the buildings around them. The city had been a symbol of peace, of civilization. But now, in the midst of this destruction, it felt hollow, a shell of what it once was. The architecture, once elegant, now shattered, seemed to echo with the ghosts of humanity's former glory. "It's not about what we left behind," Harris muttered. "It's about what they think we've hidden, and I think they're getting closer to finding it." They reached the perimeter of the old military sector, now little more than ruins. Harris's mind raced as he stepped into the center of the complex. His fingers brushed against the walls, feeling the cool, smooth surface that had once been a part of humanity's most secretive defenses. Whatever the Solkran were after, it had been hidden here, buried, protected from the invaders for centuries. Vance took the lead, pushing aside debris as he found the entrance to an old storage facility. "This is it," he said, voice low. "Everything we need to know is inside." The air inside the facility was thick with the smell of dust, the remnants of history long forgotten. The heads-up displays on their weapons flickered to life, illuminating the dark corners of the facility. It was here, in this forgotten place, that the true secrets of humanity lay. The Solkran were close, and time was running out. Harris's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped deeper into the shadows, the walls seeming to close in around him. They had reached the heart of the mystery, but the real question remained. Would they uncover the weapon the Solkran sought, or would it slip from their grasp, leaving humanity to face its greatest enemy without the one thing that could turn the tide? The underground facility was suffocating, its walls thick with the smell of rust and the damp, musty air of a forgotten world. Harris and his team had reached the heart of the complex, a place that had once been a nexus of humanity's deepest secrets, its last line of defense. The only sound in the dark, oppressive silence was the faint shuffle of boots across concrete, their footsteps swallowed by the weight of the structure around them. Harris moved slowly, his fingers tracing the outline of the control panel in front of him. The laser plasma display flickered, casting a harsh light across his face, revealing the tension etched into every feature. His hand hovered above the keypad, but something stopped him. The moment felt too heavy. He had come this far, but he could feel the Solkren closing in on them. The wind outside, sharp and bitter, whistled through cracks in the ancient building's walls, carrying the chill of an approaching storm. But it wasn't just the storm he was worried about. It was what lay behind the doors ahead. "Everything's been sealed for centuries," Vance said, his voice cutting through the stillness. "You sure this is the place?" Harris glanced at him, his eyes narrowing. "It has to be. This is where we fought the Solkren before, where humanity's greatest weapon was hidden. If they find it first, we're done." Marcus shifted uneasily behind them, his young face drawn tight with fear. "But how are we supposed to use it? All this stuff, these old systems, we're not even sure if they still work." "We're not here to figure out how to use it, Marcus," Harris replied sharply. "We're here to make sure the Solkren don't get their hands on it." His voice was low, almost a growl, as he focused back on the display. The dim light from the screen illuminated his face in a sickly hue, his expression unreadable. But deep down, Harris felt the weight of the choice he was about to make. They didn't have time to question it anymore. With a swift movement, Harris entered the access code, his heart racing. A low hum echoed through the walls as the old system powered up, the laser plasma screens flashing to life. The data scrolling across the display wasn't just the old military protocols. It was something much more dangerous, something buried deep in humanity's past. "We're not just fighting for survival," Harris said, his voice softer now, as he read the screen in front of him. "We're fighting for our future. This weapon, it's not just something we use in war. It's part of us. It's part of who we are." Vance, standing behind him, let out a quiet breath. "You're saying it's not just technology we're fighting for? It's our soul?" Harris didn't respond immediately. His fingers flew across the screen, pulling up schematics and images that no one in the team had seen before. They were detailed, complex, far beyond anything humanity had developed in the years since the last Solkren War. This was something else, an embodiment of humanity's darkest secrets, locked away to ensure they would never be used again. Marcus stepped forward, his curiosity piqued. "What is all this? What are we looking at?" "It's the key to humanity's true strength," Harris said, his voice almost reverent. "The Solkren believe we've become weak, that our peace has made us soft. But they don't know that beneath this peaceful facade lies a force that was born in war, an ancient knowledge that they're too blind to understand." The display shifted, revealing an image of an old war machine, its design brutal and stark. It was a thing of power, forged in the heat of humanity's darkest days, when survival was all that mattered. But it wasn't the weapon itself that struck Harris. It was the symbol etched into its frame, a reminder of the war that had shaped humanity's place in the galaxy. This was the weapon that could shift the balance of power, not through technology, but through sheer, indomitable will. The walls of the facility groaned as if in protest, the vibrations in the air heavy and suffocating. It wasn't just the Solkren they had to worry about anymore. Something in Harris's gut told him that this weapon was more than just a tool of war. It was something humanity was never meant to uncover. The past they were about to unleash wasn't just going to change the course of this war. It would change everything. "We need to move," Vance said suddenly, his eyes scanning the display as the data updated, showing incoming Solkren units converging on their location. The urgency in his voice pulled Harris back into the present. They didn't have the luxury of time to question the implications of this discovery. "We can't waste another minute," Harris agreed, stepping back from the console. His mind was racing, but his face was stoic. "Prepare yourselves. We're not just defending Earth anymore. We're defending everything we've forgotten." The group quickly gathered their equipment, the weight of what they had uncovered pressing down on them. But as they moved towards the exit, a sharp, sudden noise split the air, an explosion from deep within the facility. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the blast echoing through the narrow corridors. "They're here," Vance muttered, his hand tightening around his weapon. "Move," Harris shouted. "Now!" The walls around them seemed to close in as they sprinted through the narrow passageways, the sound of heavy boots pounding against the concrete. But as they neared the entrance, Harris's mind was already racing ahead, calculating their next move. The Solkren were coming for the same thing they were. Whatever it was, it had to be powerful. But the real question was whether humanity would be able to control it before the Solkren did. The distant hum of the Solkren ships grew louder, their presence nearing like a storm on the horizon. Harris's pulse quickened, his thoughts focused on one thing: survival. They had found the weapon, but now they needed to ensure it didn't fall into the wrong hands. "We're not done yet," Harris muttered under his breath, his voice low but certain. "The real fight starts now." The facility's corridors felt like a tomb as the team sprinted down them, their footsteps echoing off the cold concrete walls. Harris could feel the weight of the seconds pressing in on them, each one carrying them closer to a confrontation that could either be humanity's last stand or the moment they reclaimed the strength they had forgotten. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the promise of impending disaster. Outside, the sky had darkened further, the storm clouds gathering in a mirror of the chaos that now engulfed Earth. The distant rumble of Solkren artillery grew louder, shaking the ground beneath their boots. "We're running out of time," Vance barked, glancing at his heads-up display, his face flushed with anxiety. "If we don't move fast, we'll be cut off. They've already surrounded us." Harris's mind raced, calculating their options. The weapon they had unearthed wasn't just a relic, it was a blueprint, a roadmap to understanding how humanity had once fought off the Solkren in a war long thought to be lost in history. But it was more than just military strategy. It was a way of thinking, a philosophy rooted in the raw, untamed spirit of survival. And now, with the Solkren closing in on them, they needed to adapt that ancient wisdom to the realities of the modern battlefield. The laser plasma display on his wrist flickered, the coordinates marking their location, blinking red. The Solkren's forces were closing in, too fast, too efficiently. Harris glanced up, seeing the team's faces lit by the dim glow of the display. Fear was a thin veneer over their resolve, their bodies taut with the knowledge that they were outmatched. But Harris had something the Solkren didn't. He had the past, the forgotten fire of humanity's will to survive, to fight when there was nothing left. "Get ready," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. "This is where we make our stand. The Solkren think they've won already. They don't know who they're dealing with." Marcus, his face pale and tense, looked back at Harris, his hands trembling slightly around the weapon slung over his shoulder. "But how do we do this? We're running out of options. We can't fight them head on." Harris's eyes hardened, his grip tightening around his own rifle. "We don't fight them head on," he said, the words coming out with an almost bitter edge. "We make them fight on our terms. We use the environment. We use what they don't understand." The sound of Solkren warships above them grew deafening, their massive forms blotting out the sky. Harris could almost feel the weight of the ships, like dark clouds waiting to burst. The Solkren didn't just come to Earth for a battle, they came for its destruction. They had underestimated humanity, and that arrogance was their greatest mistake. "Vance," Harris said, his voice steady despite the chaos outside, "get to the control room. If we can tap into the old defense systems, we might be able to turn their own weapons against them. Marcus, stay with me. We've got a plan." Vance nodded, his expression grim, but there was a fire in his eyes. He wasn't questioning anymore, just following Harris's lead. Marcus gave a stiff nod, but his gaze flickered to the darkening sky again, a sense of helplessness creeping in. Harris knew that look. It was the look of someone who had seen too much too fast and wasn't sure if they could keep up. But there was no time for hesitation. They were standing on the precipice, and all they could do was jump. They reached the control room with minutes to spare. Harris's pulse quickened as the doors slid open, revealing a dusty, ancient interface, far older than anything the world had seen in the past 1,000 years. The laser plasma display flashed as the system sputtered to life, its old mechanisms groaning in protest. Harris's fingers danced over the controls, his breath shallow as he activated the defense protocols. The screen flickered, then stabilized, showing schematics of Earth's underground military facilities. Hidden systems, hidden weapons. Harris had never fully understood them. Few had. But the Solkran had a weakness, and it wasn't in their weapons or ships. It was in their arrogance. They had thought humanity would never remember, but Harris and his team had found the key, and now it was up to them to wield it. A loud crash reverberated through the walls, and Harris instinctively ducked as the room shook under the impact of another explosion. The Solkran were getting closer. "Vance!" Harris called, turning to see the older soldier working furiously at another panel. "Do you have it?" Vance didn't look up, his focus unwavering. "I've unlocked the systems, but the power's unstable. If I trigger this, it could cause a chain reaction. If we're not careful, we could take ourselves out with them." Harris hesitated for only a moment. There was no room for caution now. If they didn't act quickly, the Solkran would be on them, and the weapon they had uncovered would fall into their hands. "Do it," Harris said, his voice cold but resolute. "We don't have time to second-guess." Vance didn't need to be told twice. His fingers slammed against the console, and the room lit up as the ancient systems hummed to life, the power flowing back into the dormant weapons buried deep within the earth. Harris watched as the display showed a network of interconnected systems, some already locked onto the incoming Solkran ships. The room filled with the sound of charging energy. Harris could feel the hum in his bones, the building pressure of something ancient, something dangerous waking up. His breath came in short, sharp bursts as he focused on the task at hand, his mind racing. And then, without warning, the entire facility seemed to vibrate with energy as the ground shook beneath them. The laser plasma displays went wild, flashing red, then green, then blue. Harris's heart pounded in his chest. "It's working," Vance said, his voice laced with disbelief. "We've activated the network. They're locked on." The sound of Solkran artillery was deafening now, the rumble shaking the walls as the warships above rained down destruction. But Harris's focus was unwavering. "They've underestimated us," he muttered to himself. "They think they're the storm, but they don't know what happens when we fight back." Marcus, his face tight with concentration, kept his rifle ready, his eyes scanning the control room's surroundings. "We can't hold them off for long, Harris. We need to get out of here before they find us." Harris nodded, his mind still locked on the strategy ahead. "We won't have to run, Marcus. Not after this." He pressed the final command on the console, his fingers steady despite the rising tension in his chest. The final phase of the plan was in motion, and the Solkran would soon learn what it meant to face humanity's true weapon. The ground trembled again, and Harris felt it. This was the moment, the one where they could either break or rise. But as the first wave of retaliatory fire from the Solkran began to come, Harris knew one thing for sure. Humanity wasn't going down without a fight. The world around them seemed to vibrate as the first shockwave hit, rattling the walls of the underground facility with a force that nearly knocked Harris off his feet. His body tensed, but his mind was locked on the task at hand. He had no time to register the fear in the air, only the immediate objective. Outside, the Solkran ships were making their move, pressing forward with relentless precision, their massive forms now looming over the horizon. The laser plasma display in front of him flashed with incoming data, showing red dots closing in on their location. The time for hesitation was over. "Status report, Vance," Harris said, his voice calm but laced with urgency. He didn't need to look at the older soldier to know the pressure was mounting. He could see it in the tight lines of Vance's face, the way his fingers tapped nervously against the console. "We've got seconds, not minutes," Vance replied, his voice gritty. His eyes flicked over the screen. "The Solkran are already deploying their forces, shifting around the perimeter. They're trying to box us in, take us from all sides." Harris exhaled slowly, his thoughts already racing. The plans they had come up with, the strategies they'd honed, were all about to be put to the test. No more hiding, no more second chances. They had to fight back with everything they had, and that meant using the terrain, the environment, the things the Solkran didn't understand. "We're going to need a diversion," Harris said, his mind working the angles. He stood, his posture straight, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. "Vance, get to the secondary control room and initiate the power grid. Marcus, you're with me. We're hitting them head on, but not in the way they expect." Marcus looked up sharply, his eyes wide with uncertainty. "You sure about this?" "We don't have the firepower to face them head on. We're outmatched." Harris turned to him, his gaze steady, unwavering. "We don't have firepower, but we have something better. Speed, surprise, and the element of fear. The Solkran think they know us, but they don't. We're going to force them to react, and they won't see it coming. The fight is ours to dictate." Marcus's breath hitched, but he nodded, trusting Harris despite the gnawing anxiety in his chest. "All right, let's do it." The two men moved quickly, Harris barking orders as they prepared for the next phase of the battle. As they made their way toward the facility's exit, Harris's mind flashed back to the maps, the ancient tactics, the guerrilla strategies humanity had used long ago before peace had lulled them into complacency. The Solkran were methodical, relentless in their pursuit, but they lacked the instinct that humans had, an instinct honed by centuries of fighting to survive. The cold wind greeted them as they stepped outside, the remains of the city now a distorted silhouette against the darkened sky. The faint taste of metal filled Harris's mouth, the atmosphere thick with dust and the residue of ongoing explosions. His senses sharpened as he took in the battlefield before them. The enemy was closer now, their ships hovering in the distance, the red glow of their weaponry casting long shadows on the wreckage of Earth's defenses. "Marcus," Harris said, glancing over at the young soldier, "remember, speed and surprise. We're not fighting them directly. We're taking out their comms. If we disable their coordination, they'll be forced to fall back and regroup. They'll have to move blindly." Marcus looked down at his weapon, then back at Harris, the weight of the mission settling in. "Got it. But how exactly do we pull that off without them seeing us coming?" "We make them believe we're a bigger force than we are," Harris said, his voice cold as steel. "We hit them hard and fast in places they don't expect. We use their arrogance against them, make them think they're already winning." Vance's voice crackled through their comms, cutting through the tension. "Power's up. Ready to go." Harris nodded, then motioned to Marcus. "It's show time." The pair sprinted through the city ruins, staying low, their eyes flicking between the laser plasma heads-up displays that illuminated the dark streets ahead. Harris's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was laser-focused. The plan was simple: hit the Solkran's communication nodes, disrupt their ability to organize and create chaos in their ranks. The enemy would scatter, reacting to every move as if they were under assault from every angle. The terrain worked in their favor. Rubble, abandoned buildings, and underground tunnels provided the perfect cover. They knew the streets better than the Solkran, who had only just arrived. Harris could hear the distant thrum of Solkran troops advancing, their heavy footsteps a reminder of the weight of the battle ahead. But they weren't just facing soldiers. They were facing an enemy that hadn't anticipated humanity's resilience, its ability to turn the tide even when it seemed impossible. They reached their target, the first of the comm stations, quietly, efficiently, slipping past the Solkran forces positioned outside. Marcus set the charges with practiced precision, his hands steady despite the tension in the air. Harris's eyes never left the horizon, scanning for movement, listening for any signs of enemy troops. The silence was unsettling, the anticipation thick as they waited for the right moment to strike. The click of the detonator echoed in the dead silence. A burst of light, a shockwave that rattled the walls, and then nothing. The comm station was down, the enemy's ability to coordinate severed, if only for a moment. Harris's pulse raced, the rush of success fueling his next move. "We've got their attention now," Harris muttered, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the battlefield. "Vance, you're up. Start the diversion. We need them to think this is just the beginning. Vance's voice crackled through the comms. On it. Hold tight. The sound of heavy artillery suddenly erupted in the distance, the Solkran forces turning their attention toward the newly activated diversion. Harris watched as their lines fractured, their once-formed discipline splintering as chaos began to take root. It was working. Their plan was unfolding perfectly. The Solkran were distracted, vulnerable. "Now we strike," Harris said, his voice low but urgent. "This is the moment. Move fast." Marcus nodded, his face set with determination. "Let's finish this." The two soldiers charged forward, weaving through the wreckage and using the cover of smoke to stay hidden. They moved with purpose, swift and lethal, like shadows in the night. The Solkran forces ahead were scattered, confused, their lines no longer as disciplined as they had been when they first arrived. Harris could feel the tide turning. The Solkran had made their first mistake. They underestimated humanity's will to fight. Now they would pay the price. The laser plasma displays flashed once more, confirming their position, marking their targets. Harris fired, his shot accurate and deadly, taking out a Solkran commander who had been trying to rally his troops. The soldiers around them stumbled, disoriented, their once organized formations now shattered. "Keep pushing," Harris shouted, adrenaline surging. "We can't stop now." As the team pressed forward, the sound of Solkran ships retreating echoed in the distance, the realization settling in that the tide had turned. They had done it. Humanity had struck back. But this was just the beginning. Harris knew that while they had forced the Solkran into retreat, the true test was yet to come. The stakes were higher than ever, and now, with the first victory behind them, the question remained. Could they sustain this momentum long enough to secure their place in the galaxy? The battle had shifted in a way Harris couldn't fully process, but there was no denying it. The Solkran were retreating. He could hear the rumbles of their warships pulling back, the deep vibrations traveling through the Earth like the final tremors of an earthquake. Earth's battered defenses had held, and the initial shock of defeat had turned into something else, something undeniably human. The sound of distant artillery fire was now punctuated by the sudden silence, and Harris let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "You did it!" Vance's voice broke through the quiet, rough around the edges, but tinged with something like relief. "You pulled it off. The Solkran, they're pulling back." Harris stood still, his chest rising and falling with the weight of the moment. He could feel the weight of their success, but it didn't feel like victory. Not yet. The enemy had been repelled, yes, but what had humanity truly won? The Solkran had underestimated them, but the price of this victory would shape their future forever. He could still hear the roar of the Solkran ships in the distance, a reminder that the battle was never truly over. Marcus was at his side, eyes wide with disbelief, his voice still edged with that tension that wouldn't let go. Are we really done? Is it over?" Harris turned to him slowly, his face unreadable. "It's never over," he said, his voice carrying the weight of all the battles fought, all the lives lost. "But we've made our point." Marcus frowned, but Harris could see the flicker of understanding in his eyes. They had fought not just for Earth, but for the very idea that humanity could rise again, even after centuries of peace. The Solkran had thought humanity weak, had thought Earth's age of diplomacy and technology made them soft, complacent. But humanity's greatest strength had always been its ability to adapt, to rise from the ashes when there was nothing left. "The galaxy will never look at us the same way again," Vance said, his voice low. "They know what we're capable of now." Harris felt the weight of his words settle in. It wasn't just the Solkran who would change their minds. It was the entire universe. Earth's place in the galaxy was no longer guaranteed by treaties or trade. It was earned through blood, sweat, and the raw spirit of survival. The thought lingered in his mind like an iron weight. "That's the point," Harris muttered, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the last of the Solkran warships flickered and vanished into the distance. "They underestimated us. They thought we'd been quiet for too long, that we had forgotten how to fight. But they don't know what it means to be human." The wind had picked up, swirling around them like a low, constant hum, tugging at their clothes as the final embers of the battle died down. The acrid taste of the war hung in the air, the heavy scent of earth and smoke lingering around them. The distant sounds of retreating Solkran forces were now just an echo, fading into the night. The battlefield, scarred and broken, stretched before them, a silent testament to the resilience of Earth and its people. Marcus took a slow breath, then turned to Harris, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't think we had it in us. I knew we had the fire, but this was something else." Harris nodded, his expression softening just for a moment. "We've always had it in us. We just needed to remember." They stood there in silence, the weight of victory hanging between them, until Vance's voice cut through the quiet once more. "Harris, what happens now?" The question hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. Harris turned to face him, his mind still racing. The Solkran had been pushed back, but they weren't defeated, not yet. They'd learned nothing if they rested on this one victory. No, the future of humanity would have to be shaped by more than just surviving the fight. It would have to be defined by the strength to rebuild, to adapt to the future, and to do so without forgetting what had made them strong. "We rebuild," Harris said, his voice steady, though the weight of the answer pressed down on him. "And we prepare. This isn't over. The Solkran will be back, and when they return, we'll be ready. But we've proven something today, something that will echo in the stars. The universe won't forget what happened here." The sun, just beginning to dip below the horizon, cast an orange glow over the desolate landscape. The debris of the battlefield lay scattered before them, twisted metal, broken concrete, and the remnants of lives spent defending their home. It was a stark contrast to the serene calm of the sky above, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Harris could feel the weight of history bearing down on them, the responsibility of their actions stretching out before him. Earth was no longer just a quiet planet in the galaxy. It was a force to be reckoned with. The Solkran had learned that lesson, but the true test had only just begun. The galaxy, for better or worse, would remember the day humanity had risen from the ashes of its forgotten past. "The Solkran will be back," Harris said, his voice quieter now, but with an unmistakable edge of finality. "And we'll be ready." Marcus stood beside him, his eyes narrowed against the wind, his gaze set on the horizon. "So we make sure they never forget this day. We make sure everyone knows what it means to underestimate humanity." Harris let out a breath, his chest tightening with the weight of the truth. "We don't just fight for survival. We fight for what makes us human. And that is what will always be our greatest weapon." The quiet after the battle seemed to stretch forever, as if the world itself had paused to reflect on the events that had unfolded. The stars began to twinkle above, a reminder of the vastness of the universe. Yet, for all the infinite space between them and the galaxies beyond, Earth had stood firm. They had fought back, not with technology or firepower, but with something far more dangerous, the indomitable will to survive and adapt. The Solkran had learned that humanity would never bow to anyone. Earth's greatest weapon was not its technology. It was its people. It always had been. As the last remnants of the warships faded into the distance, Harris turned toward his team, his gaze resolute. "This is just the beginning," he said. "Humanity isn't just surviving anymore. We're taking our place among the stars, and no one, not even the Solkran, will ever forget who we are." And for the first time in centuries, the galaxy was reminded that humanity wasn't weak. It was a force that would rise again, and again, no matter the challenge.